The BFM Breakfast Grill. Top interviews you can't afford to miss. Presented by the CIMB Group.
This morning on the Breakfast Grill, we are talking to Chris Roebuck, the visiting professor of transformational leadership at Cass Business School out of London. Chris is as well a former head of global leadership at UBS, the Swiss bank. Chris, a very warm welcome to you. Now, let's start off the discussion with the now infamous Goldman letter from Greg Smith, the disenfranchised employee, where he described the environment there as being toxic and the fact that some of the senior bankers there are calling their own clients Muppets, but 100 Muppets in every organization, I'm sure. How do you think Goldman's, in your opinion, Chris, could have handled the crisis better from a leadership standpoint?
I think there's a couple of issues there that relate to the degree to which Goldman's has gotten it to the point where an employee is prepared to send a letter to the New York Times, which calls into question the view of that employee, certainly. But also there's certainly another clear issue, which is the fact that there is a perception that Goldman's has altered its culture over the period from pre-financial crisis to subsequently, and that it's become more used to the idea of we need to get the money out of clients at all costs. Now, to be fair, Goldman's and other investment banks have obviously had the idea of getting money out of clients because that's the way they make business. But I think what's happened is that it's got slightly more desperate, so to speak, as the markets have got more difficult. So there is an issue there, but it's also worth remembering that this particular individual was in an area that was dealing in products and probably didn't have that much of a relationship with clients. If you look across this issue in any number of banks, I think it's fair to say that you find that those people who have an intimate working relationships with individuals in particular as clients, or organizations, be it M&A, be it private banking, then actually there is a degree of integrity and regard for the client. Where you have a part of the bank that is dealing in a transactional relationship where it's mainly on price, it's on product, then particularly if you're also going through third parties or dealing with anonymous organizations, because there isn't that human link with an individual, there is a tendency not to view the client as a person and then to some degree, even if it's subconsciously, view them as fair game, so to speak.
The impression that you seem to offer is that you are a little bit protective of the banks, but as a financial columnist in the FT pointed out some days ago, he said that there's probably 100 Greg Smiths in every top investment bank in town anyway. But as you suggest, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between those bankers who have a direct client relationship and those who don't. But from a leadership standpoint, how would you close this gap between those who have and those who don't have a relationship?
That's absolutely simple. That's really clear. And the quite simple rule is that you have to deal with your clients with total integrity, and what you are dealing with is a situation where you have to do the best for the client. And anybody in any organization, not only banks, but any commercial organization who starts viewing their clients as Muppets and starts trying to deal with them as cash cows, as far as the leadership of that organization is concerned, in my view, that's getting to the point where you're having a lack of integrity about how you should treat your customers and clients. And at that point, you should be out.
You speak extensively, you even lecture on how employees need to become more entrepreneurial. But especially in the investment bank sphere, taken to the nth degree, though, Chris, where bankers in the quest for profit and in the quest for the dollar, to the exclusion of everything else, including client interests, and it all obviously goes horribly wrong in some cases. Is this theory of transformational leadership then flawed as a result?
No, I don't think so, because if you look at the objectives of investment banks, and also if you look at, for example, the attitudes of people who are in the sales area of many, many organizations, they naturally take an entrepreneurial view to some degree of how they interact with the market and how they interact with their clients. Now, often the issue is that the organization has to put in place some form of process and risk management structure to make sure that those people, to put it bluntly, don't become too entrepreneurial in their attitudes. But the challenge is that the rest of the organization tends, by virtue of the corporate ethos, particularly as the organization gets larger, to stop thinking in an entrepreneurial way and start thinking in a process-oriented and bureaucratic way. And the problem is that you then get a disconnect with the client-facing part of the organization from the rest of the organization. So the client-facing part is trying to be entrepreneurial, and the rest of the organization is becoming increasingly bureaucratic and corporate-minded, and they want to minimize risk rather than optimize risk. And what that means is that the organization fails to deliver either on what its potential is or on what its customer wants. And my view is that the whole organization needs to be entrepreneurial in a managed, risk-controlled way. So not too much entrepreneurial activity at the front end that creates risk, and more entrepreneurial activity in the rest of the organization to support client service.
It sounds good, but it's very hard to do, because if you look at, and we're staying on the Goldman's issue here, Chris, Lloyd Blankfein, who is the CEO of Goldman Sachs, you could argue quite convincingly that most of the bankers who work for Lloyd, who work for Blankfein, are acting in the Blankfein's mold, right, which is highly entrepreneurial, highly profit-seeking, perhaps to some surgical precision.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. And in any organization, what you will get is you certainly see that there is a quite clear indication that people will copy the behavior of the people who are in leadership positions above them. And that's one of the core reasons why people who are at the top of any organization, let alone an investment bank, need to demonstrate the sort of behavior that they want reflected in the rest of the organization. So it's not, don't do as I do as I say, is totally unacceptable. And I think there have been examples where that sort of behavior at the top has subsequently led to problems further down. Now, investment banking to some degree is a special case. And most organizations out there don't necessarily behave in that way. They behave in an entrepreneurial way, but that's a slightly specialized market. Having said that, it's also, if you look at what happened in terms of the interrogation of Blankfein and the other Goldman's senior executives by the Senate committee, looking at what had happened in the financial crisis and around that area, it's fair to say that the one thing that became absolutely clear from that hearing was that Blankfein and his executives were on a completely different planet to the senators who were coming out with what could be construed as typical man-in-the-street questions that actually were quite down to earth. For example, could you possibly explain to me how you can take 3 lots of bad debt and magically turn it into good debt?
In fact, that's a major part of the problem, Chris, because one would say that Lloyd Blankfein is not an isolated case, because you could say the same thing of Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan. You could say the same thing of Vikram Pandit at Citigroup. All these guys, at their level, they're all thinking the same way. They're all basically, in their quest for quarterly profits and growth, have basically lost the plot in a little way, don't you think?
No, not necessarily. I think at that, I would suggest that at that level, they get the plot in terms of the need for sustainability of revenues and profits, because we know that the market wants sustainability. In general terms, the issue about people going for quarterly figures, from my experience, and it's not just in banking, it's in other sectors as well. It's a few levels down from the people at the top. It's effectively a reflection of your remuneration, and it's the fact that you want to maximize your remuneration as quickly as possible. And to be blunt, bearing in mind you're not at the top of the organization and therefore not involved in long-term share options or other retention initiatives, you don't particularly care, because as far as you're concerned, you want the money in your pocket now. And therefore, it's that particular group of people where I think there is a challenge, much more than the people at the top, actually.
And yet, in your discussion on bonuses, Chris, you seem to be more in favor of the bonus proposition as opposed to the whole performance remuneration proposition, as opposed to paying people in the hope of future performance. So, Is the whole bonus culture the lesser of the two evils here?
It depends which way you want to look at it. You have to be on a spectrum. You have to have an element of performance-related pay to be effective, but you have to be in a position where that performance-related pay, and this is the key point, is encouraging the right behaviour and not the wrong behaviour. In terms of performance-related pay, even local governments around the world that are public sector organisations use bonuses. It makes absolute sense to get people to be paid on performance they have delivered, not on the hope of performance they might deliver. However, that has impact. For example, within the financial services world, the model for financial services in relation to private banking and certain other financial sales tends to be, in Europe, high level of salary and a portion of bonus on top. In the US, it could potentially be up to 100% commission. Now, we know that one of the causes of the problems with the mortgage market in the US was the fact that many of the people selling the mortgages to the people who couldn't afford them were on 100% commission. So it's quite simple. Either you get this business in or you don't get paid. You have a client who can't really afford the mortgage, but they desperately want it. And to be blunt, that is an accident waiting to happen. And it was an accident that did happen, and we've seen the consequences. So performance-related pay is good if it's applied right and if it encourages the right behavior. But if you structure it wrong, it can absolutely drive completely the wrong behavior that is going to increase your risk and cause problems in the long term.
Chris Roebuck, the visiting professor of transformational leadership at the Cass Business School out of London, is with us on the Breakfast Grill today. In just a few minutes, Chris will get your views on your previous role at UBS and where you achieved considerable success at in terms of driving performance. This morning on the Breakfast Grill, we are talking to Chris Roebuck, the visiting professor of transformational leadership at the Cass Business School out of London, as well as being the former head of global leadership at UBS. Now, in regards to your role at UBS, Chris, you achieved considerable success. The prize for top company for leaders in 2005, a number of corporate university awards and Corporate University Awards, as well as a Harvard Business School case study being written on the project. But despite these plaudits, UBS managed to fall foul of the rules several times, and I'm going to cite the case of Kweku Adeboli, right? Mm-hmm. At the time, a 31-year-old trader on the Delta One desk of the investment bank. Now, his losses for the bank were eventually confirmed at $2.3 billion. So, what went wrong there?
I think it's fair to say that in any bank, no matter how well it's managed, what will happen will be that somebody will manage to get through the system. And I was certainly shocked by the fact that, A, somebody had managed to get through the system in such a big way, and B, that it was at UBS. Historically, prior to the financial crisis, the quality of risk management at UBS was thought to be some of the best in the world. Now, it looks to me like this is a particular case where you have an individual who had the ability to get through the system. The fact, I understand, that he had spent some time in the back office, so probably had more understanding of how the risk control systems operated than other people. But that does not remove the fact that even if he'd have had that knowledge, the systems should have actually picked that up and should have stopped it happening. On the other side of it, if you view that as the process side of the system, where the electronics should have stopped those positions being taken, there's also the people side of the equation, which is that this individual, having got themselves into trouble, or having the feeling that they were beginning to get into trouble, should have been able to go to their boss and should have been able to say, look, I think I'm in trouble, I need some help. And certainly from the sort of Twitter messages that were publicized that he transmitted to his friends, you can see that there is evidence that perhaps he was looking for help and a way out. So therefore there is a question as to what is going wrong with an organization where somebody who needs help and somebody who has to get help to effectively minimize the risk to the organization is not getting that help because of the culture. And I think this goes back to your earlier point in relation to the culture in investment banks, where, and I have seen it, and it is an issue within those institutions, but again, not only banks. I can think of other sectors where you have a culture of, I must be perfect, I must only succeed, I must never admit that I'm wrong, I can take risks, and I can just keep upping the stakes, and in the end, being eternally optimistic, it's all going to work out right.
Well, now here's the thing, Chris. Banks, as a general rule around the world, commercial banks are quite well regulated. They are quite well overseen by the central banks of this world. But in recent times, and most recently, I guess, out of France, where the French left-wing politician François Hollande is arguing a case to separate, investment banking and commercial banking. Now, it does appear that of all the recent frauds in recent years, and I'm going to cite people like Jérôme Creviel at Société Générale. Mm-hmm. Yasuo Hamanaka, who was a corporate trader at Sumitomo, of course, Abadoli as well, and don't forget the Nick Leesons of this world and the Bernie Madoffs of this world. They've all come from the investment banking side of the business, where risk is obviously uppermost in their minds.
Yeah, I don't think that the risk is necessarily uppermost in their minds. I think that what happens is that in that particular element of international banks, there is more of a cultural appetite for taking risk than there is, for example, in the retail part of those institutions. And that's why you have to have good, tight risk systems, but you also have to have the right culture, because one of the other elements of risk, which is a ripple effect of having a financial problem like Leeson and the others, is that this does significant reputational damage to the institution. And there is a reputational damage that can be produced from people doing things wrong that are not actually illegal or against the regulations. And the only way you can manage that is you have to have in those institutions, in the culture, a quite clear understanding for everybody in the bank of what is the right behavior and what is the wrong behavior. A top international banking chief risk officer said to me once, he said, I know in my bank that across the world, somebody somewhere is doing something wrong. The whole point of my risk control systems is to make sure that I catch that before it gets out of control. And then he said, but I would sleep much easier at night if I knew that people weren't doing things wrong. And the only way they can do that is to understand in their heads what's right and what's wrong, not have to rely on systems to catch it.
Now, Chris, in the evolution of the banking industry, this heavy risk-on approach has only been really in the last 25, 30 years where legislation allowed such risk-taking to occur. Do you see, and of course not much seems to have changed in the last 25 to 30 years in terms of the regulatory oversight and the capturing of these individuals who have caused massive amounts of losses to their employee banks. Do you see a point in time in future when banks will return to the old days where they were the stable institutions that threw off cash to shareholders in the form of dividends and were very risk-off in their approach?
You see that to some degree anyway if you look at a sort of full-width international bank in terms of the investment banking component, the private banking component, the retail components, wherever those may be in the world, and those other elements. Now, inherently, the retail elements of banking are still pretty bureaucratic, pretty process-orientated, pretty tightly risk-controlled. And going back to your point about, it's the investment banks where all of this stuff happens that shouldn't happen. In all fairness, it's not just the investment banks, because this sort of stuff in terms of people doing things wrong happens in retail banks as well. The point is that in a retail bank, however, it's only going to be that somebody has lost $100,000, and that isn't newsworthy. If somebody loses $2.3 billion, that is newsworthy. So making the assumption that things are going absolutely smoothly and none of this ever happens in retail banking is wrong. It's just that it's not a large enough amount to attract too much interest. So, and the core problem is, and again I say this doesn't just apply to banks, this applies to all large organizations. in your organization, you will have people who stick to the values of that organization in relation to how they behave, the levels of integrity, and how they treat customers and how they manage risk. However, statistically, like any population, you will have a small group of people who will not stick to those rules and who will try and find a way around them. And what has to happen in the organization is that, A, the people around them are prepared to say, no, don't do that. That's not acceptable behavior. And if they do it, they are prepared to report them. And that those at the top of the organization or in leadership roles are prepared to immediately stamp down on that behavior, irrespective of how much money that person is making for the organization. Because if they let that person get away with it just because they're making a lot of money for the organization, then everybody else in the organization will view behaving without integrity or treating customers badly as acceptable, and they'll start doing it. And in the end, it will get the bank into a position where it's either facing class actions, regulators' action, or whatever.
Onto the wider issues of human resources, Chris. You've also spoken about the need, for example, in countries like Denmark, for organizations to recognize the value of, workers in the 50-plus age range and to use them more effectively. Now, in a country like Malaysia, which has no choice but to raise the retirement age because of the high cost of living, what pointers could you suggest to this segment of the working population pursue in order to make themselves more relevant?
Certainly, first of all, this is a major demographic issue for both USA and for Europe. And in particular, the reason that Denmark has a problem is that Denmark created an initiative to allow graduates into the workplace by encouraging people to leave the workplace 3 years earlier than normal retirement age. However, they can't get rid of that initiative. So they have a specific problem there that is a major problem, with up to 70% of the leaders, in particular in the public sector, being able to retire in the next 5 years. In Asia, the demographic is slightly different. However, and I think culturally also, in the West, the attitude is, if you are over 50 and you are on the board, it's good, because being over 50 means you have significant experience. Sometimes the attitude in the West is, if you're over 50 and not on the board, therefore you're getting old, you don't have as much energy, etc., etc. That is totally contradicted by all the statistics that show quite clearly that in relation to the ability to deal with customers, in relation to loyalty to the organization, in relation to people being determined to get the job done and carry it through, in relation to the ability to and preparedness to give extra effort for the organization, consistently older workers, more experienced workers, come out better than younger workers. And that's the fact. And also, it depends on your customer demographic. It is absolute madness if your customer demographic has the largest band in the group 40 plus to utilize people who are interacting with that group who are less than 40 plus. Because, again, irrespective of where you are in business, if your sales force is reflective of your customer base in terms of both culture and demographics, you are much more likely to get the business than if it's not. And I think that those points show that certainly the traditional Western assumption that once you're over 45, you're past it, is completely wrong. I think in Asia it's fair to say that there is culturally much more respect for the older generation, and I don't necessarily think you have got that pervading Western attitude of once you're over 45, you're too old.
Absolutely. And just very quickly, because we're running out of time, Chris, UBS, like many of Malaysia's conglomerates, which count foreign shareholders as major owners, has its own set of integration challenges like cultural differences, racial differences, geographic differences. What strategies then best to sew all these different folks together?
You have to have something that inspires people, something that says to people, we want to be part of this organization. And in particular, as an employee, you want to have the opportunity to be part of a successful organization. And if you think you're a high flyer, you want to have the opportunity to move around the world to build your career. I think my experience in Malaysia and elsewhere, and particularly the fact that I was speaking to some people at Maybank, shows to me quite clearly that one of the real challenges that the big banks face is the growth of high-quality, aggressive, entrepreneurial regional banks who have the regional presence, the cultural understanding, they have the feed-in from their retail activities and other activities that allow them to potentially and quite credibly steal business from the large internationals. And I think the large internationals underestimate the ability of the large regionals to attract top talented people and to attract customers.
Chris Roebuck, Professor of Transformational Leadership at Cass Business School in London, thank you very much for your time. BFM 89.9.
Be privy to expert views on the economy, distilled down to must-listen insights on The Breakfast Grill on BFM 89.9. Brought to you by the CIMB Group, Southeast Asia's leading universal bank.